My hands tremble now when I try to hold this recorder. The doctors told me yesterday that my heart is failing. They didn't say it directly, but I heard it in the way they spoke to my daughter in the hallway. Quiet voices, slow sentences, the kind people use when they already know the end is close. For more than 30 years, I have carried a secret that has poisoned every moment of my life. And before I die, I need someone to know the truth. My name used to be Elena Varga, but the name on my documents today is different, because after what happened, I had to disappear from the world I once knew. I had to start again somewhere no one would ever find me. But even if you run to the other side of the earth, the past follows you. It waits in the dark, just like the hospital corridors where everything began. In 1993, I worked as a night nurse in a small regional hospital in Eastern Europe. It was not a modern hospital. The building was old, built during the Soviet era. The walls were yellowed with age, and the fluorescent lights flickered like they were about to die. During the day, the hospital felt busy and alive, but at night, it felt like a completely different world. After midnight, the corridors became silent. Only the machines in the intensive care unit broke the quiet, the slow beeping of heart monitors and the soft mechanical breathing of ventilators. At the nurse station, we often joked that the hospital after 2 a.m. felt like a ghost town. But that year, my life outside the hospital was falling apart. My younger sister, Irina, was dying. She had a rare liver disease, and the doctors said the only chance she had was an expensive operation in another country. The cost was impossible. My father had already sold his workshop. My mother worked every day without rest. I worked double shifts for months. But the money we managed to collect was still only a small fraction of what was needed. I remember the moment the surgeon told us the price. My sister sat in the chair beside me, trying to smile like everything was fine. But when we left the hospital, she started crying. "I don't want to die," she whispered. Those words stayed inside my head like a curse. Because when someone you love says that, you begin to think about things you never imagined you could do. The first time I met Dr. Petrov outside of work hours was in the hospital parking lot. It was a cold November night. The wind cut through my uniform like knives. I was sitting in my car crying when someone knocked on the window. It was him. Dr. Viktor Petrov was one of the senior surgeons in the hospital, a respected man, intelligent, calm, the kind of doctor patients trusted immediately. He asked me what was wrong. At first, I told him it was nothing. But when people are desperate, the truth comes out easily. Within minutes, I told him everything about Irina, about the operation, about the money we didn't have. He listened carefully without interrupting. Then he said something strange. "Sometimes life gives us difficult choices, Elena." I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. 2 nights later, he asked me to meet him in a storage room near the surgical wing. When I arrived, another man was already there. I had never seen him before. He wore an expensive coat and gloves, even though he was inside the building. His eyes were cold, the kind of eyes that study people like objects. Petrov introduced him only as Mr. Sokolov. They spoke in quiet voices. Petrov explained that there were people in the world waiting desperately for organ transplants, people who would die if they didn't receive help quickly. And sometimes, official waiting lists were too slow. I felt uneasy listening to them. Then Sokolov placed a small envelope on the metal table. Inside was more money than I had earned in an entire year. My hands started shaking. "This is only the beginning," he said calmly. I immediately pushed the envelope back. "I'm a nurse," I told them. "I save people. I don't—" Petrov interrupted me gently. "No one is asking you to harm anyone." But what he explained next slowly turned my world upside down. He said that some patients in the intensive care unit were already beyond saving. Patients with catastrophic injuries, patients whose organs were still healthy, but whose lives were already ending. According to him, they would die soon anyway. The difference was simply when, and if the timing was changed slightly, those organs could save other lives. The room suddenly felt too small to breathe. I remember whispering the only question that mattered. "What do you need from me?" Sokolov answered, "You work the night shift." His voice was calm, almost friendly. "You control the patient records during the night. You can move files, adjust reports, delay certain calls." My heart started pounding so loudly I thought they could hear it. "This is illegal," I said. Petrov sighed. "Elena, life isn't always black and white." Then he pointed to the envelope. "That money could pay for your sister's surgery." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small apartment staring at the envelope on the kitchen table. Every minute my mind repeated the same words. "Irina doesn't want to die." But another voice inside me whispered something darker. What if someone else has to? By morning, I had made the worst decision of my life. The first patient was an old man named Anton Lebedev, 74 years old, severe heart failure. He had been in intensive care for days, and the doctors believed he would not survive the week. The second patient was a man in his 30s who had been brought in after a brutal car accident. His condition was unstable but not hopeless. That fact still burns inside me like acid. Because hope means possibility, and possibility means someone might live. That night, I walked through the ICU corridor, feeling like the air itself was watching me. The lights were dim. The machines beeped slowly. Both patients lay in their beds, surrounded by wires and tubes. Sokolov's men arrived shortly after midnight. They moved quietly, professionally, like shadows. I tried not to look directly at them, but I heard everything. The sounds, the machines, the silence that followed. By morning, the hospital reports were already written. 2 patients had died during the night. Natural complications. That's what the files said. The money arrived the next day, and a week later, my sister had her surgery. She survived. For years, I told myself that what happened had saved her life, but the story didn't end there, because once you step into darkness, it doesn't let you leave. And the second time they came to me, it was no longer a request. It was a threat. For a while, I convinced myself that what happened that night would never happen again. I told myself it was a terrible mistake born from desperation. I believed that once my sister recovered, I could close that chapter of my life forever. But the truth is something I only understood later. People like Sokolov never let you walk away. 3 weeks passed after the first night. My sister was recovering slowly after her surgery. For the first time in months, my parents were smiling again. They believed a miracle had saved her. Only I knew what that miracle had cost. Every time I visited Irina in the hospital, she squeezed my hand and said the same words. "You saved me?" Those words felt like knives. Because the truth was that I had not saved her alone. 2 other families had lost someone the same night. But the world continued normally. The hospital corridors were still quiet at night. The same machines beeped beside the beds. The same doctors walked past me as if nothing had ever happened. For a short moment, I almost believed the nightmare was over. Then one night, at the end of my shift, I found an envelope inside my locker. Inside was money, more than before, and a small piece of paper. On it was written only 3 words. "Tonight, same corridor." My stomach turned cold immediately. I didn't go to the storage room that night. Instead, I left the hospital as quickly as possible and drove home with shaking hands. I locked my door and turned off the lights. I thought if I ignored them, everything would disappear. But 2 days later, the phone rang at my apartment. A male voice spoke calmly. "Elena, you forgot something at the hospital." I didn't answer. He continued speaking. Your sister leaves the clinic tomorrow afternoon, correct? My entire body froze. He then slowly listed the street where my parents lived, the school my younger cousin attended, the small cafe where my father drank coffee every morning. They knew everything. When the call ended, I understood something terrifying. I was no longer part of a decision. I was part of a system, and systems don't release their pieces. That night, I returned to the hospital. Sokolov was waiting in the same storage room. He looked disappointed. "You made us wait," he said quietly. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry. "I don't want to do this again," I whispered. He smiled slightly, like a teacher correcting a child. "Elena, this is not about what you want." Then he leaned closer. "You helped us once. That means you are already inside." Petrov stood beside him, silent, avoiding my eyes. Sokolov placed 2 folders on the table, 2 patient files. The first was a 68-year-old man with severe brain trauma after a fall. Doctors had already noted that his condition was critical and unlikely to improve. The second file made my heart stop. A young woman, 24 years old, internal bleeding after a highway accident, but according to the notes, she was still responding to treatment. I looked at Petrov. "This one could survive," I said. He didn't answer. Sokolov closed the folder calmly. "Survival is a complicated concept." I felt sick. "No," I said quietly, but Sokolov leaned closer again. "You have a sister who just received a very expensive surgery," he said softly, "and accidents happen to families every day." The room felt like it was shrinking around me. That was the moment I understood something that terrified me even more than the first night. The first time I had chosen this path. Now I had no choice at all. The second operation happened 3 nights later. The hospital was quiet again, just like before, but this time the fear inside me was different. It was heavier, colder, because I knew exactly what was about to happen. The young woman from the accident lay unconscious in her bed, her breathing assisted by machines. Her face was pale but peaceful. Someone had placed a small photograph on the table beside her bed. 2 parents standing with her near a lake. They looked happy. Normal. Human. I stood beside the bed for a long time. My hands trembled as I checked the monitors. Part of me wanted to run down the corridor and scream for help, but another part of me saw my sister's face in the hospital room weeks earlier, and I froze. Shortly after midnight, Sokolov's men arrived again. This time there were 3 of them. They wore dark clothing and carried medical cases that looked identical to those used by surgical teams. Everything happened quickly. Too quickly. I remember the sound of a machine alarm suddenly cutting through the quiet corridor. Then someone silenced it. And just like that, another life disappeared inside the darkness of that hospital. By morning, the reports were written again. Complications. Cardiac arrest, the official language of hospitals. But the world outside those walls would never know the truth. The money arrived again, more than before, enough to buy silence for a long time. But something inside me had already started breaking. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the photograph beside the young woman's bed. Her parents smiling near the lake, and every night the same thought returned. What if she would have survived? That question slowly began to destroy me, but the worst moment came 2 months later, when police officers walked into the hospital and asked about missing medical records. That was the day I realized something else. The system Sokolov controlled was larger than I had imagined, much larger. And once you become part of something like that, escaping it can cost more than your life. After the police officers walked into the hospital that morning, everything changed. At first, it seemed like a routine visit. Hospitals receive police questions all the time, about accidents, about injured drivers, about paperwork. But something about the way they moved through the corridors felt different. They were not looking for information. They were looking for someone. I remember standing at the nurse's station, pretending to check medication charts while two detectives spoke quietly with the head administrator. One of them carried a thick folder filled with photographs and documents. From where I stood, I could see only one photo clearly: the young woman from the accident, the one whose picture with her parents had been placed beside her hospital bed. My heart began to race so violently that I thought I might faint. The detectives spent hours inside the hospital that day. They asked questions about the emergency room, about medical records, about the timing of certain deaths in the intensive care unit. One nurse later told me she had heard them mention something strange: missing documentation, medical reports that had been altered. For the rest of that shift, I could barely breathe, because for the first time since everything began, I realized something terrifying. Someone outside the hospital had started asking the right questions. That evening, I went home earlier than usual. I locked my apartment door and pulled the curtains closed, even though it was still daylight. My hands were shaking as I turned on the television. The local news mentioned the accident victim again, the young woman. Her parents had publicly questioned the hospital's explanation of her sudden death. According to the report, she had been stable for hours before her condition mysteriously collapsed during the night. The journalist used one sentence that made my stomach turn cold: "Authorities are examining irregularities in the medical timeline." Irregularities. That word echoed in my head like an alarm. For 2 days nothing happened. Then Sokolov called me. His voice was calm as always, almost bored. "You look nervous lately, Elena." I tried to sound normal. There were police officers at the hospital. I know. The way he said those words made my skin crawl. "How?" I asked. He chuckled softly. "Because people talk." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his voice changed. Harder. "You will say nothing if they ask you questions." "I haven't." "Elena," he interrupted me quietly, "you remember your family, yes?" My throat tightened immediately. He continued speaking as if he were discussing the weather. "Your sister goes to physiotherapy every Tuesday morning. Your father still drinks coffee at the same cafe near the market." A cold wave ran through my entire body. He was reminding me, not threatening loudly, just reminding. Then he added one final sentence before ending the call: "Stay calm, everything is under control." But it wasn't. 3 days later, the detectives returned to the hospital. This time, they spoke directly with several staff members from the intensive care unit, including me. When the officer approached the nurse's station, my legs felt weak. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his early 30s. His partner, an older woman with sharp eyes, stood beside him holding a notebook. "Miss Varga?" he asked. I nodded. "We just have a few questions." We moved into a small consultation room near the corridor. The officer placed several documents on the table: hospital records, death reports, shift schedules. "You were on duty the night of November 18th, he said. "Yes, and also the night of December 3rd. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. "Yes." He tapped the papers gently. 2 patients died during those shifts under unusual circumstances. I forced myself to breathe slowly. "In intensive care, that happens," I replied quietly. The older detective studied my face carefully. Then she slid a photograph across the table. It was the young woman again. Her smile in the picture looked painfully alive. "According to earlier reports," the detective said slowly, "this patient was responding to treatment hours before her sudden cardiac arrest." I didn't answer, because I knew that every word could destroy me. After a long silence, the younger officer finally closed the folder. "For now, we're simply reviewing procedures. he said, but the look in the woman's eyes told me something different. They suspected something. When I returned home that night, I found another envelope waiting at my door. Inside was money again, but this time there was also a small photograph. My sister, taken that very morning as she walked out of the physiotherapy clinic. My entire body went cold. On the back of the photo were only 4 words: "Do not forget." That was the moment I understood that the police investigation was not the only danger surrounding me. Sokolov's network was watching everything, and if I tried to escape, they would know. For weeks I lived between 2 nightmares. During the day, I feared the detectives would return with more questions. At night, I feared that Sokolov's men might appear again in the corridors. Then one evening, something happened that changed everything. A doctor from another department approached me quietly in the hospital cafeteria. His name was Dr. Markovich, a cardiologist who had recently transferred to our hospital. He leaned close and whispered something that made my heart stop. "Someone is altering patient files in the intensive care system," he said. I tried to look surprised, but he continued speaking. "I reported it yesterday." The world around me suddenly felt unstable. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Markovich looked around the room before answering. "The police believe there may be an illegal transplant network operating through several hospitals." My hands began to tremble again. He studied my face for a moment, then said something that nearly made me collapse. "They think someone inside the hospital is helping them." That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I sat alone in my car in the hospital parking lot for hours, staring at the building. The same building where I had once believed I was saving lives. Now it felt like a trap slowly closing around me. Because sooner or later the detectives would discover the truth. And when they did, Sokolov would not allow me to speak. That was the night I made the second most important decision of my life. The first had been accepting the envelope. The second was understanding that if I wanted my family to survive, I would have to disappear. Not just leave the hospital, not just leave the city. I would have to leave everything behind and run to the other side of the world. Before Sokolov realized I was planning to escape, the moment I understood that I had to disappear, my life turned into a quiet race against time. I could no longer trust anyone. Not the hospital administration, not the police, and certainly not the people who had pulled me into their world. Every corridor, every ringing phone, every unfamiliar face suddenly felt like a threat. For days, I acted as if everything was normal. I went to work, I checked patient charts, I answered questions from doctors and spoke politely to colleagues. But inside my mind, something else was happening. I was preparing to run. At night, when I returned home, I began collecting documents, passports, old certificates, anything that could help me leave the country quickly. But escaping was not as simple as buying a plane ticket. Sokolov's message had made that very clear. They were watching my family, and if I disappeared suddenly, they would immediately understand why. So I had to do something that still breaks my heart even today. I had to distance myself from the people I loved. For several weeks, I visited my parents less often. I told them work was exhausting, that the hospital needed me during night shifts. My sister, who was slowly recovering, didn't understand the sudden change in my behavior. One evening, she asked me directly, "Why are you acting like you're leaving?" Her question froze me. I forced a smile and told her she was imagining things, but deep inside I already knew something terrible. If I wanted to save them, they could never know where I was going. The police investigation inside the hospital continued quietly. Detectives appeared again 2 weeks later. This time they spoke with doctors from the surgical department. Rumors spread quickly through the building. People whispered about illegal transplant networks operating across several countries. Some mentioned cases from other cities where medical staff had been arrested for falsifying death reports. Each rumor made my fear grow stronger, because every detail sounded too close to the truth. Then, one night, something happened that convinced me my time was running out. I finished my shift around 3 in the morning and walked toward the hospital parking lot. The streets were empty and covered with a thin layer of winter fog. As I reached my car, I noticed another vehicle parked nearby, a black sedan. The engine was running. At first, I told myself it meant nothing, but when I opened my car door, the window of the sedan slowly lowered. Inside sat one of Sokolov's men. I had seen him before during the nights in the intensive care corridor. He didn't say hello. He didn't smile. He simply looked at me and spoke in a calm voice. "Mr. Sokolov is disappointed." My hands tightened around the car keys. "I've done everything he asked," I said quietly. The man shook his head slightly. "You've been talking to the wrong people." My heart stopped. I haven't told anyone anything. He studied me for several seconds, then leaned slightly closer. "You spoke with Dr. Markovich in the cafeteria." My stomach dropped. They knew. They had been watching even inside the hospital. The man continued speaking slowly. "You should remember something, Elena." He paused. "People who know too much sometimes disappear." The engine of the sedan grew louder as he prepared to drive away, but before the window closed, he added one final sentence. "Be careful with your next decision." That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my apartment staring at the city lights outside my window, realizing something that terrified me even more than before. They no longer trusted me, which meant I had become a risk, and risks in their world were usually eliminated. 2 days later, I met the only person who would unknowingly help me escape. Dr. Markovich. He approached me again during a quiet moment in the corridor. "You look exhausted," he said. "I haven't been sleeping," I replied. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly. "I shouldn't tell you this, but the police believe someone connected to the hospital may try to leave the country soon." My heart pounded. "They're monitoring airport records and border crossings." For a moment, I felt completely trapped. If I stayed, Sokolov's people might silence me. If I ran, the police might stop me. But then Markovich mentioned something unexpected. "A colleague of mine works in a medical research center in South America," he said. "They're always looking for nurses with experience." South America. Another continent, another world. The idea sounded impossible, but suddenly I realized something important. If I left quickly enough, both sides might lose track of me. The following week became a blur of quiet preparations. I withdrew small amounts of money from different banks. I packed only the essentials. I erased contacts from my phone. Most importantly, I said goodbye to my family. Not openly, not honestly, just small moments. A dinner with my parents, a walk with my sister, conversations that seemed ordinary on the surface but felt like final memories inside my heart. The night I left the country was cold and silent. I carried only one suitcase and a passport that would soon become useless. As the plane lifted from the runway, I looked down at the city lights disappearing beneath the clouds. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief, but that feeling lasted only a few minutes. Because deep inside, I understood something terrifying. You can change your country. You can change your name, but you can never escape the truth of what you have done. And for the next 30 years, that truth followed me everywhere. Until this moment, the moment when my heart is finally failing, and I no longer have the strength to run from it. The first years after I fled felt unreal, like living inside someone else's life. The medical center where I found work was located in a coastal city thousands of kilometers away from the country I had left behind. The language was different, the streets were different, even the smell of the air felt unfamiliar. For the first time in months, no one there knew my past. No one knew the name Elena Varga. No one knew about the hospital corridors where 2 lives had disappeared during the quiet hours of the night. I became someone else, a nurse with a new identity, a new apartment, and a new life that looked normal from the outside. But the human mind is not built to erase the past so easily. During the first year, the nightmares started. At first, they came once or twice a month. Then they came almost every night. In those dreams, I always walked down the same hospital corridor. The lights were dim, the machines beeped slowly, and the doors of the intensive care unit stood open. Inside one of the rooms, the young woman from the accident was lying in the bed, exactly as I remembered her. Her face pale, her breathing assisted by machines, but in the dream she opened her eyes, and she looked directly at me. Not with anger, not with fear, just with a quiet question that echoed in my mind long after I woke up. Why? For years I tried to build a normal life despite those memories. I worked hard. I avoided anything that reminded me of intensive care wards. Whenever possible, I asked to be assigned to pediatric departments or outpatient clinics, places where patients recovered instead of dying. But the past has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. Almost 15 years after I fled my country, I was sitting in a small cafe near the hospital during my lunch break when a news report appeared on the television. At first, I wasn't paying attention. The broadcast was about a large international investigation involving illegal organ trafficking networks operating across several countries in Eastern Europe. Then I heard a name that made my hands freeze around the coffee cup. Sokolov. The report described how authorities had uncovered a network of doctors, brokers, and intermediaries who arranged illegal transplants for wealthy clients. Several hospitals were suspected of involvement, including the one where I had once worked. The investigation had taken years, but eventually dozens of people were arrested. Some doctors were sentenced to long prison terms. Others disappeared before they could be captured. When the report ended, I realized something strange. Instead of relief, I felt something heavier, because none of the victims mentioned in the investigation included the 2 patients I remembered. Their deaths had never been questioned publicly. Their families never learned what truly happened. For the world, those deaths remained simple medical tragedies. But for me, they were something else. They were the weight I carried every single day of my life. Years passed. My hair turned gray. My daughter grew into an adult woman with a life of her own. The world continued moving forward as it always does. But I never forgot those nights. Sometimes, when I walked through quiet hospital corridors during late shifts, I would hear the distant sound of heart monitors and feel the same cold fear I had felt decades earlier. And I would remember the moment when I first accepted that envelope. That moment had changed everything, not just my life, 2 other lives as well. Now I am lying in another hospital bed, older, weaker, waiting for the same machines to eventually fall silent beside me. The doctors think I am resting when they leave the room, but instead I am finally doing the one thing I should have done 30 years ago, telling the truth. I know that confessing now cannot change the past. It cannot bring those patients back. It cannot erase the suffering of their families. But maybe, somewhere, someone will hear these words and understand something important. Desperation can make ordinary people commit terrible acts, not because they are monsters, but because fear and love can twist the human mind into believing that saving one life is worth any cost. I believed that once. I believed that saving my sister justified what I did. But the truth is simpler. Every life has the same value, and the moment we decide otherwise, we lose a part of our humanity. If the families of those patients are somehow listening to this confession, I want them to know something. Their loved ones were not forgotten. For 30 years, their faces followed me through every quiet corridor and every sleepless night. And now, at the end of my life, there is only one thing left to say. I am sorry. This is the truth I carried for 3 decades, and before I die, I could no longer keep it hidden.